Please don't hit me. I'm already hurt." The pregnant woman pressed herself against the cold brick wall, blood mixing with rain on her split lip, her whole body shaking as footsteps approached. But the man who found her that night wasn't the monster she was running from. Ronald Willie, a single father who knew what it meant to be abandoned, would kneel in that filthy alley with his 7-year-old son and make a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Because sometimes the most broken people create the strongest families. And sometimes all it takes to save a life is 7 simple words. "You're safe now. Come home with me." Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain hammered against the dumpster lids like 1,000 tiny fists, each drop another reminder of the cold that had settled into Fine Lane Street that November night. Ronald Willie pulled his son closer, their Thursday dinner tradition at Betty Diner running later than usual. "Dad, did you hear that?" Peter's small voice cut through the storm. Ronald stopped. There it was, a whimper, barely human, coming between the cardboard boxes.
"Please don't hit me," the voice whispered as Ronald's shadow fell across her. "I'm already hurt." The woman was curled against the brick wall, her torn sleeve exposing purple bruises that painted a story Ronald knew too well, her hands wrapped protectively around her pregnant belly, and her eyes. Those eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from having hope beaten out of you, literally. "I'm not going to hurt you," Ronald said, raising his open palms. "My name is Ronald. This is my son Peter. You are safe now." She flinched at the word safe, as if it were foreign to her vocabulary. "Dad, she's hurt." Peter tugged at his father's jacket. "We have to help her. Like you always say, when someone needs help, we help." Ronald knelt slowly, maintaining distance. The woman's entire body tensed, ready to run despite having nowhere to go. Her bare feet were bleeding, leaving pink puddles in the rain. "What's your name?" Ronald asked gently. She hesitated, as if giving her name might summon the very demon she had escaped. "Sophie," Sophie finally whispered. "Sophie Hunter. Sophie, you're soaking wet and you're hurt. You need to get warm and dry." "I can't. He'll find me. He always finds me." "Who will find you?" Sophie's hand instinctively moved to her jaw where the bruising was darkest. "It doesn't matter. I shouldn't have run. I should go back before—" "No." Ronald's voice was firm but kind. "You are not going back to whoever did this to you."
Peter stepped forward, his 7-year-old wisdom shining through the rain. "My mom left us too," he said simply, "but she left because she wanted to. You left because you had to. That's different. Dad says when someone's in trouble, you don't walk away." Sophie looked at this small boy, his innocence cutting through her fear more effectively than any adult reassurance could. Ronald stood, removing his jacket. "Here, put this on. My car is right there. We have a warm apartment, hot food, and a comfortable couch you can sleep on. No questions tonight. Just safety." "Why?" Sophie's voice cracked. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Because," Ronald said, wrapping his jacket around her trembling shoulders, "someone once told me that the measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy, but what he does when it's hard. And walking away from you right now would be the hardest thing I'd ever have to live with." The drive to Ronald's apartment was silent, except for Sophie's chattering teeth and Peter's occasional directions from the back seat. "Turn here, Dad. Remember to avoid the pothole on Rattle Street." The boy's normalcy in this abnormal situation was oddly comforting.
Sophie sat rigid in the passenger seat, her body coiled like a spring. Every red light made her scan the mirrors. Every car that pulled alongside them made her sink lower in her seat. "He's not following us," Ronald said quietly. "I've been checking." "You don't know him," Sophie whispered. "Ken doesn't give up what he thinks belongs to him." The name slipped out before she could stop it, and with it, a piece of her story. Ronald's jaw tightened. He'd seen men like Ken before, had worked construction sites with them, had watched them talk about their girlfriends and wives like property, but he kept his voice steady. "Well, Ken doesn't know me either, And he definitely doesn't know that I've got the entire Oakwood construction crew on speed dial. Good luck getting through 30 union guys who've already adopted you as their sister." For the first time, the ghost of a smile flickered across Sophie's face. Their apartment wasn't much, a two-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades, but it was warm, clean, and filled with the evidence of a loving home. Peter's artwork covered the refrigerator. Photos of father and son at baseball games, camping trips, and school events lined the hallway. Books were everywhere. "I'll make you a peanut butter sandwich," Peter announced with the authority of a chef. "It's the best medicine. Dad says so when I'm sad."
Sophie sank onto the couch, Ronald's jacket still wrapped around her like armor. The normalcy of the apartment felt surreal after months of walking on eggshells in Ken's pristine showplace of a home, where every item had a specific place and moving something an inch could trigger rage. "How far along are you?" Ronald asked, noticing how she protected her belly. 7 months, Sophie said. The baby is why I finally ran." Peter returned with a sandwich that had clearly been made with love, if not skill. The peanut butter was thick, the jelly escaping from all sides. "I added extra jelly," he said proudly, "for the baby." As Sophie ate, the first real food she'd had in 2 days, Ronald disappeared and returned with a first aid kit, clean towels, and a set of his ex-wife's clothes she'd left behind. "The bathroom is down the hall," he said. "Take as long as you need. There's a lock on the door. Peter and I will be right here when you're ready." Sophie stood, swaying slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Ronald met her eyes. "Because 2 years ago, my ex-wife, Amanda, left us for another man. Just packed up one day while we were at work and school, left a note saying she'd found her true love. Peter was 5. He stood at that door for 3 hours that first night, convinced she'd come back. I learned something that night. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives prepare us to help others through theirs." Sophie's tears came then, silent rivers mixing with the rain still dripping from her hair. "Go get cleaned up," Ronald said gently. "You're safe here. I promise." While Sophie showered, Ronald made up the couch with fresh sheets, and Peter gathered what he called comfort supplies. His favorite teddy bear, a flashlight in case she's scared of the dark, and a book about puppies because puppies make everyone happy. "Dad," Peter said quietly, "her face looks like Mom's did that time she walked into the door." Ronald's chest tightened. His son was too observant, and had seen too much for 7 years old. Amanda hadn't walked into a door. She'd been covering for a fight with her lover that had turned physical. One of many secrets that came out after she left. "Yeah, buddy, but Sophie's going to be okay. We're going to make sure of it." "Is she gonna live with us?" "I don't know, but she's going to stay until she's safe." Peter nodded with the simple acceptance of childhood. "Good. I like her. She looks sad but nice, like the moon when it's hiding behind clouds." Sophie emerged from the bathroom transformed. Clean, warm, wearing clothes that hung loose on her thin frame. The bruises were more visible now. A purple-green map of violence across her jaw, her arms, disappearing beneath the collar of the borrowed shirt. She sat carefully on the couch, her movements those of someone who'd learned that sudden motions meant pain. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to. Just rest. We can talk tomorrow if you want, or not at all. Whatever you need." Sophie looked at Peter, who had arranged his comfort supplies on the coffee table like offerings. "Your son is special." "He gets that from his mother," Ronald said, then caught himself. "The good parts anyway." That first night, Ronald barely slept. He sat in the kitchen keeping watch, his old baseball bat within reach. Not because he expected trouble, Ken didn't know where they lived, but because he'd made a promise. Sophie was safe here. Around 3 a.m., he heard movement. Sophie stood in the doorway, Peter's teddy bear clutched to her chest. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Ronald poured 2 cups of tea, and they sat at his small kitchen table. In the dim light, with the rain still falling outside, Sophie began to talk. "I met Ken when I was 18. I'd just aged out of foster care. My parents died when I was 8, a house fire. No relatives wanted me. I spent 10 years bouncing between homes, never belonging anywhere." Ronald listened without interrupting, understanding that sometimes the most important thing was simply to witness someone's pain. Ken was older, successful, charming. He said I was his everything.
For 2 years, it was perfect. I thought I'd finally found my family. Then, slowly, things changed. He didn't like my friends. He said my job at the bookstore was beneath me, made me quit. He handled the money, chose my clothes, and decided everything.
Sophie's hand went to her stomach. When I told him about the baby, I thought it would fix things, make him the man he used to be. Instead, he said the baby was another chain to keep me in line. The beatings got worse. He was careful, never where it would show if I was dressed, until tonight. What happened tonight? Ronald asked gently. I dropped the plate. I was washing dishes, my hands were soapy, and it slipped. He came at me worse than ever before. And when I was on the floor, when I saw him pull his foot back to kick my belly, to kick our baby, something in me snapped. I rolled away and ran. No shoes, no coat, no plan, I just ran. And I took something with me. I don't even know why. Or maybe I do, but... She trailed off. Willie didn't press. He wanted her to open up at her own pace. You saved your baby, Ronald said softly. You saved yourself. Did I? He'll find me. He always said if I left, he'd make me regret it. He has money, connections. I have nothing, just my word against his. Ronald leaned forward. You have us now. And Sophie, you have more than you know.
If you're watching this and you've ever been in Sophie's position, know that there are people like Ronald out there. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. The next few weeks fell into a routine. Ronald went to work at his construction job, Peter went to school, and Sophie began to heal. She took over cooking, real meals, not the takeout Ronald and Peter had survived on. She helped Peter with his homework, her patience endless, even when he struggled with math. You're really smart, Peter told her one evening. Why did you stop working? Sophie glanced at Ronald, who nodded encouragingly. They decided to be honest with Peter, in age-appropriate ways. Someone I trusted told me I wasn't good enough to work, but they were wrong. Like when Billy at school says, I throw like a girl, Peter asked. Dad says Billy's wrong and also that lots of girls throw better than Billy. Sophie laughed, a real laugh that surprised everyone, including herself. Exactly like that. But healing isn't linear. Sophie would flinch when Ronald moved too quickly. She'd panic if someone knocked on the door. She kept a bag packed by the couch, ready to run. At night, Ronald could hear her crying softly, trying to muffle the sound in Peter's teddy bear. 6 weeks into her stay, Ronald made a decision. I'm going to talk to him, he announced at dinner.
Sophie's fork clattered to her plate. No, Ronald, please. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand plenty. Men like Ken are cowards. They hit women because they know women won't hit back. Let's see how he handles someone his own size. Dad's really strong, Peter added, helpfully. He can lift 2 bags of concrete at the same time. Despite her fear, Sophie smiled at Peter's faith in his father. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for another person when it mattered most? That's what real strength looks like. If this story is resonating with you, leave a comment about a time someone stood up for you, or when you stood up for someone else. Ronald found Ken's workplace easily enough, a gleaming financial firm downtown where Ken worked as an analyst. Ronald walked through the marble lobby in his work boots and flannel, ignoring the stares from the suited executives. He waited outside until Ken emerged for lunch, tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who'd never thrown a real punch in his life, only the cowardly kind against those who couldn't fight back. Ken, Ronald called out. Yes, if you're looking for maintenance, it's in the basement. I'm looking for you. We need to talk about Sophie. I don't know what she's told you, but she told me enough. You need to turn yourself in to the police. Apologize to Sophie and face the consequences of what you've done.
Ken laughed, actually laughed. And who are you supposed to be? Her new protector? Let me explain something, lowlife. Sophie is disturbed. She makes things up, creates drama. Whatever sob story she's sold you, the bruises tell a different story, Ronald cut in sharply, fists digging into his palms as he held himself in check. She's clumsy, always has been, and frankly, it's none of your business. Sophie's my fiancée. We had a little disagreement, and she overreacted. She'll crawl back once she realizes she's got nowhere else to go. Ronald's jaw tightened. She's not coming back, ever. Ken stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think you're some kind of hero? Sophie has no evidence, no police reports, no witnesses, no case. She's a foster kid with mental problems and a baby she can't afford. I'm a respected professional with a spotless record. Who do you think people will believe? His smile turned cruel. She'll always be just a pitiful woman trying to trap me with a baby. And you're just another stupid wannabe hero thinking with something other than your brain. When she's done using you for shelter, she'll move on to the next sucker. That's what girls like her do.
Ronald's control nearly snapped. Every muscle in his body screamed to put Ken through the nearest wall. But he thought of Peter, of Sophie, of the example he needed to set. "You're wrong about her," Ronald said evenly, "and you're wrong about evidence." Ken's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ronald held his stare, voice calm but edged with steel. "It means Sophie's smarter than you think, and men like you always leave a trail. You're not as untouchable as you believe." "Is that a threat?" "No," Ronald said coldly. "It's a promise. Stay away from Sophie, stay away from us, or you'll find out just how many friends a so-called wannabe hero can have. Friends who don't take kindly to men who hit pregnant women." Ken's smirk faltered for just a second before returning, nastier than ever. "Get out of here before I call security. And tell Sophie if she knows what's good for her, she'll come back where she belongs. She has 1 week before I come looking for her myself." Ronald returned home to find Sophie pacing, Peter trying to distract her with a board game. "What did he say?" Sophie asked immediately. Ronald's expression told her everything. "He's not going to leave you alone." Sophie sank onto the couch. "I told you, he doesn't give up what he thinks he owns." "Then we go to the police." "With what? He's right, I have no proof. It's my word against his." Sophie stood suddenly, her face determined. "Actually, that's not entirely true."
Ronald and Peter watched as Sophie pulled out her phone, an old model she'd hidden in her pocket that night. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked it and handed it over. 6 months ago, after he broke my ribs, something in me changed. I started documenting everything. Ronald looked at the screen, photos of bruises, dates, and descriptions, text messages from Ken threatening and controlling. And then Sophie said something that changed everything. "There's more. I bought a camera, a tiny one. I hid it in our living room, in a fake plant. It's been recording for 6 months." "You have video?" Ronald asked, stunned. Sophie nodded. "Hours of it. Him hitting me, threatening me, saying exactly what he'd do if I left. I uploaded everything to a cloud account he doesn't know about. I wasn't planning. I didn't think I'd ever actually leave, but some part of me knew I needed insurance." Ronald stared at her, silent for a beat. Then, softly, "Sophie, this is evidence. Real evidence. We can take this to the police." "I was too scared before, but now—" Her gaze shifted to Peter, whose wide eyes held every word. A faint tremor softened her voice as she whispered, one hand resting on her belly. "Now, I have something to fight for. People to fight for." Peter suddenly bounced to his feet. "We're gonna get the bad guy, just like in Dad's detective shows." Despite everything, Ronald and Sophie both smiled. "Tomorrow," Ronald said firmly, "we go to the police. Together." "All 3 of us," Peter added with a grin. "We're a team!"
That night, Sophie showed Ronald some of the video footage. He had to stop after 10 minutes, his hands shaking with rage. The violence was worse than he'd imagined. Ken wasn't just abusive, he was sadistic, taking pleasure in Sophie's pain, narrating his attacks like a sportscaster. "How did you survive this?" Ronald asked. "I had to. First, because I had nowhere else to go. Then, because of the baby. And now," she looked at him, something new in her eyes. "Now, I want to survive for me. I want my daughter to grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to fight back." "It's a girl?" Ronald asked. Sophie nodded, smiling. "I found out last week. I'm going to name her Hope." "That's perfect," Ronald said, and meant it. If you've ever had to find courage you didn't know you had, remember Sophie's story. Sometimes the first step is the hardest, but you don't have to take it alone. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that message today. The next morning, they went to the police station. Sophie clutched the flash drive containing 6 months of evidence. Peter held her other hand, claiming he was her backup. The detective, a woman named Priska, with kind eyes and 30 years of experience, took them seriously from the start. She watched the first video, with a professional mask that cracked when Ken's voice, crystal clear, said, If you ever try to leave me, I'll make sure no one ever finds your body. You're mine, Sophie. Forever." "This is more than enough," Detective Priska said. "We can arrest him today." "Today?" Sophie's voice was small. "With this evidence, he's a flight risk. We'll pick him up at his office." Sophie gripped Ronald's hand. "He'll be so angry." "He'll be in handcuffs," Detective Priska assured her. "He can't hurt you anymore."
2 hours later, Detective Priska called. Ken had been arrested at his office in front of all his colleagues. The same man who had mockingly claimed Sophie had no evidence was let out in handcuffs, his carefully constructed image shattered in minutes. "He's being held without bail," Detective Priska explained. "The violence in those videos, the threats, no judge is letting him out. You're safe, Sophie." Sophie collapsed into Ronald's arms, sobbing, but these weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of relief, of freedom, of finally being able to breathe without wondering if each breath would be her last. Peter patted her back awkwardly. "It's okay to cry. Dad says sometimes crying is just your heart taking a shower." Through her tears, Sophie laughed. The trial was swift. With the video evidence, Ken's lawyer convinced him to take a plea deal, 5 years in prison. It didn't feel like enough, but it was a start. A lifetime restraining order, a promise of distance. And for Sophie, for now, that was enough. The day of sentencing, Ken finally saw Sophie again. She stood tall, Ronald and Peter flanking her pregnancy now obvious. Ken's expression was one of shock. This wasn't the broken woman he'd controlled. This was someone new, someone strong. "You did this," he hissed at her. "No," Sophie said clearly. "You did this. Every punch, every kick, every threat. You chose that. I just chose to stop letting you." As they led Ken away, he looked back one more time. Sophie didn't flinch, didn't look away. She'd already moved on.
Spring arrived with hope. The delivery was difficult, Sophie's body still healing from months of abuse, but she fought through it with the same determination that had carried her this far. Ronald and Peter waited in the hospital room, Peter having made a "Welcome to the World Princess" card covered in glitter and crayon hearts. When the nurse asked if the father wanted to cut the cord, Sophie said clearly, "He's in prison where he belongs, but my family is here." Ronald and Peter exchanged glances, both understanding the weight of that word, family. Hope was perfect. Tiny fingers, her mother's nose, and already a fighter, her first cry strong enough to echo down the hospital corridor. "She's loud like you, Peter," Sophie said, exhausted but smiling. "That means she's smart," Peter declared with 7-year-old logic. The first months were a blur of feedings, diapers, and sleepless nights. Ronald had converted his office into Sophie's room permanently, and Peter had declared himself Hope's big brother, taking his duties seriously. "I'll teach her everything," he told Sophie one evening as Hope gripped his finger, "like how to tie shoes and ride a bike, and that vegetables are actually not poisons, even though they taste like it." Sophie laughed, really laughed. It was happening more often now, these moments of pure joy, unmarred by fear.
Ronald watched from the doorway, something shifting in his chest. He'd been so focused on helping Sophie heal, on being what she and Hope needed, that he hadn't noticed when his feelings had changed. Or maybe they hadn't changed. Maybe they'd been there from that first night, when she'd whispered those broken words in the rain. But Ronald was careful, so careful. Sophie needed time to heal, to find herself again. He never pushed, never assumed. They were roommates, co-parents of sorts, friends. If that's all they ever were, it would be enough. Sophie noticed his distance, the way he'd pull back if they accidentally touched, how he'd leave a room if it felt too intimate. She understood and was grateful. After Ken, she'd thought she'd never want another man near her. But Ronald was different. He was gentle without being weak, strong without being controlling, present without being suffocating. Still, she wasn't ready. Not yet. Summer brought changes. Sophie got a job at a local bookstore, the owner happy to let her bring Hope in a carrier. She opened her own bank account, got her driver's license, small steps toward independence that felt like giant leaps. "I'm proud of you," Ronald told her one evening as she showed him her first paycheck. "It's not much," she said. "It's yours. That makes it everything." Peter nodded sagely. "Like my allowance. Dad says it's not about how much money you have, it's about earning it yourself.
Your dad's smart, Sophie said, catching Ronald's eye. He reads a lot, Peter explained, but only boring books without pictures. One evening, as summer turned to fall, Peter made an announcement at dinner. Sophie, are you going to marry my dad? Ronald choked on his water. Sophie froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Peter, Ronald managed. What? You like each other. You live together? We're already a family. It sounds normal. Sophie set down her fork, choosing her words carefully. Your dad and I are taking things slow, buddy. Why? When you know something's right, why wait? That's what Dad always says about dessert. That's different, Ronald started. Is it, though? Peter interrupted with the philosophical confidence only a 7-year-old could muster. Sophie laughed. You're right about one thing, Peter. We are a family. Peter nodded, satisfied. Good. But also you should probably marry him because he really likes you. He stares at you when you're not looking. It's kind of weird, but also nice. Ronald buried his face in his hands as Sophie's laughter filled the kitchen.
This is your reminder that love doesn't always arrive when we expect it, or in the package we imagined. Sometimes it comes after heartbreak, through healing, in the quiet moments of ordinary life becoming extraordinary. That night, after Peter was asleep, Sophie found Ronald on the small balcony, watching the city lights. He's not wrong, you know, she said quietly. Ronald turned. About the staring? I'm sorry, I try not to. About all of it. Sophie stepped closer. Ronald, you saved my life. But more than that, you gave me the space to save myself. You showed me what a real man looks like, what real love looks like. Sophie, you don't owe me. I'm not talking about owing. I'm talking about choosing. Ken took my choices away for years. You gave them back. And I choose you. I choose us. When you're ready, when I'm ready, I choose this family we've built. Ronald reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His hand cupped her face gently, thumb brushing over the cheek that had once been purple with bruises. I've been ready since the night I found you, he admitted. I just needed you to find yourself first. I have. I'm Sophie Hunter. I'm a survivor. I'm Hope's mother. I'm Peter's friend. And I'm falling in love with Ronald Willie, even though he reads boring books without pictures. They kissed them, soft and careful, full of promise and patience.
24 months after that rainy night in the alley, Ronald proposed, not with fanfare or grand gestures, but quietly in their kitchen while Sophie was feeding Hope and Peter was doing homework. I know we both have scars, he said, holding out a simple ring he'd saved for months to buy. But maybe that's what makes us right for each other. We know what it's like to be broken, and we know how to help each other heal. Sophie said yes, tears streaming down her face, tears of joy, of gratitude, of finding something she'd never thought possible. Finally, Peter exclaimed. Can I be the ring bearer? I promise not to drop them this time. This time? Ronald asked. I've been practicing with my toy rings. I only dropped them twice yesterday. The wedding was small, perfect, held in the backyard of the house Ronald had saved up to buy, their house, with enough rooms for everyone and a garden where Hope could play. Peter walked down the aisle with the rings tied to a pillow, his concentration intense. Hope toddled behind him, throwing flower petals with enthusiastic inaccuracy, most landing on herself. Sophie's dress was simple, second-hand, and exactly right. She'd invited Detective Priska, who cried through the entire ceremony. Ronald's construction crew served as groomsmen, their tough exteriors melting as they watched their brother marry the woman they'd all come to protect. In his vows, Ronald said, "You whispered that you were broken the night we met, but broken things can be mended, and sometimes they become stronger at the broken places. Thank you for letting us be your safe place. Thank you for becoming ours." Sophie's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. You showed me that love isn't control, it's freedom. It's choosing to stay not because you have to, but because you want to. I want to choose you every day for the rest of my life. Peter, not to be outdone, loudly announced, "And I promise to help Hope with her homework when she's older and only complain a little bit." The small gathering laughed through their tears. As Sophie stood there, surrounded by their chosen family, holding Hope in one arm and Peter's hand with the other, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From orphan to victim to survivor to beloved.
She had spent so many years believing she was alone, that she deserved the pain because she had no one else. But Ronald and Peter had shown her a different truth, that family isn't always about blood, that love doesn't require perfection, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the darkest moments.
Detective Priska approached during the reception. "You know, in 30 years of doing this job, I rarely get to see the happy endings. Thank you for letting me be part of yours." "It wouldn't have happened without you believing me," Sophie said. "You had the evidence. I had more than that. I had them." Sophie looked at Ronald teaching Hope to dance, her tiny feet on his shoes, Peter spinning around them in circles. Ken would serve his full 5 years, no early release for good behavior, after he'd attacked another inmate. Sophie rarely thought about him anymore. He'd taken enough of her life. She wouldn't give him any more space in her mind. Instead, she focused on the present, on Hope's first words, "No," and "Peter." On Peter's school plays where he proudly introduced his mom and dad and sister. Ronald's gentle presence, his steadfast love, his terrible dad jokes that made her laugh anyway. They were building something beautiful from the ashes of their separate heartbreaks. Not perfect. Perfection was a myth that had nearly killed her. But real, sturdy, worth fighting for. One evening, 3 years after that night in the alley, Sophie found Ronald in Hope's room reading her a bedtime story. Peter was sprawled on the floor, adding dramatic sound effects. "And the princess saved herself," Ronald read, "with the help of her friends, who became her family." "Like Mommy," Hope said sleepily. "Exactly like Mommy," Ronald agreed, catching Sophie's eye.
Sophie joined them, squeezing onto the tiny toddler bed. Peter climbed up too, making it a tight fit. "Tell the rain story," Hope requested. It had become a family legend, carefully edited for young ears. "Once upon a time," Sophie began, "there was a woman who was lost in a storm. But a kind man and his son found her and brought her home. And then," Hope prompted, though she knew the story by heart, "and then they all became a family. The best kind of family. The kind you choose." "And they lived happily ever after," Peter added. "No," Sophie corrected gently, "they lived real ever after. With good days and bad days. Laughter and tears, but always, always together." As Sophie watched her daughter drift off to sleep, safe in a room painted sunshine yellow, surrounded by love and laughter and possibility, she thought about that terrified woman in the alley, the one who'd whispered she was broken. She wasn't broken anymore. Or rather, she was, but she'd been put back together with gold, like those Japanese bowls. Beautiful not despite the cracks, but because of them. Because the cracks showed the story, the journey, the strength it took to rebuild. Ronald's hand found hers in the dim light of Hope's nightlight. Peter yawned and snuggled closer. Hope's breathing deepened into sleep. This was her family, not the one she'd been born into. Not the one she'd thought she wanted with Ken, but the one she'd found in the most unlikely place, a rain-soaked alley on the worst night of her life that had become the first night of her real life. "Thank you," she whispered to Ronald. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Ronald squeezed her hand. "You were always there, Sophie. You just needed someone to hold the light while you found your way."
If you've made it this far in Sophie's story, you understand that sometimes our greatest tragedies become our greatest triumphs. That the families we choose can be stronger than the ones we're born into. That broken doesn't mean worthless, it just means you've been tested and survived. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to start over, that there are still good people in this world, and that sometimes the very thing that breaks us is what leads us to where we're meant to be. Don't forget to subscribe to Soul Lift Stories for more real, raw, powerful stories of human resilience, unexpected love, and the courage it takes to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Remember, you're not broken. You're becoming.